The story of female civil servants and nurses in Nazi Germany reveals one of the most complex and morally ambiguous chapters in 20th century history. Between 1933 and 1945, millions of German women found themselves drawn into the machinery of the Third Reich, not necessarily as ideologues or fanatics, but as ordinary participants in a state that transformed daily work into instruments of control, exclusion, and ultimately destruction. Their roles in administration, healthcare, and welfare work illuminate how the Nazi regime mobilized gender, ideology, and bureaucracy to sustain a totalitarian order. Far from being passive bystanders, many women became active contributors to the functioning of the Nazi state, whether as clerks managing racial records, secretaries transmitting policies, or nurses and welfare workers enforcing the doctrine of racial hygiene. The experiences of these women reveal not only how a dictatorship reshaped professional life and moral boundaries, but also how conformity, ambition, and a sense of duty could coexist with complicity in oppression. When Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party came to power in 1933, they inherited a Germany still grappling with the economic depression and the social upheaval of the post-World War I period. Women had gained limited emancipation during the Weimar Republic, entering the workforce and civil service in growing numbers as typists, teachers, and nurses. Yet the Nazi seizure of power quickly redefined these trends under the banner of ideology. National Socialism exalted women primarily as mothers and homemakers, the bearers of racial purity and moral order within the family. The slogan Kinder, Küche, Kirche encapsulated the regime's vision of feminine virtue. However, this rhetoric concealed a paradox. While the Nazis idealized domestic womanhood, they also depended on women's labor to sustain a rapidly expanding bureaucratic and welfare state. The contradiction between ideological restriction and pragmatic mobilization became one of the defining features of women's experiences under Nazism. Female employment in the civil service, healthcare, and welfare sectors was not new in 1933, but under Nazi rule it was infused with political meaning. Women who had previously served as clerks or nurses were now expected to embody and enforce the principles of National Socialism in their daily work. Bureaucracy, often regarded as a neutral sphere of routine paperwork, was transformed into a powerful instrument of ideological governance. Administrative workers processed racial classifications, tracked genealogical records, and managed correspondence that directly affected the lives and deaths of millions. Similarly, nurses and welfare officers became enforcers of racial hygiene, the pseudoscientific doctrine that sought to purify the German population by eliminating hereditary illness and perceived biological weakness. Through their roles in hospitals, asylums, and welfare institutions, women became the human interface between state policy and individual lives. Their compassion, discipline, and professionalism, qualities traditionally associated with caregiving, were repurposed to serve the brutal logic of eugenics. The Nazi regime's approach to women's work was deeply pragmatic. During the early years, the government encouraged women to leave paid employment to make room for unemployed men and to focus on marriage and childbearing. Policies such as marriage loans and the dismissal of married women from the civil service reinforced this domestic ideal. Yet as the regime consolidated power and expanded its administrative reach, it became clear that women's labor was indispensable. The bureaucratic expansion of the 1930s, driven by population surveys, propaganda ministries, and welfare programs, created a growing demand for educated clerical workers. Tens of thousands of young women were recruited into offices at all levels of government, where they became the invisible infrastructure of a regime obsessed with control. Typing letters, filing documents, recording data, and managing correspondence may have seemed apolitical tasks, yet these functions were essential to the enforcement of anti-Semitic laws, the organization of forced sterilization, and later the coordination of deportations during the Holocaust. In the medical and welfare sectors, women's work was equally critical and equally compromised. Nursing, traditionally considered one of the most virtuous and self-sacrificial professions, was redefined under Nazi socialism as a patriotic duty to the racial community. The Reich Nurses League, RNSD, founded in 1934, centralized all nursing under Nazi oversight and ensured ideological conformity among its members. Nurses were trained not only in medical practice, but also in racial theory, eugenics, and the political ethics of Nazi socialism. They were expected to evaluate patients not merely as individuals in need of care, but as biological assets or liabilities to the Volksgemeinschaft, the national community. In hospitals and mental institutions, many nurses participated in the sterilization and killing of patients deemed unfit, whether through direct action or silent cooperation. Others provided care in maternity homes operated by the Lebensborn program, which sought to promote the birth of racially pure children. The moral boundaries of the profession were thus eroded, as the act of healing became subordinated to the state's racial objectives. The integration of women into Nazi institutions was facilitated by a network of organizations designed to instill ideological discipline. The National Socialist Women's League, NS-Freundschaft, and the German Women's Enterprise, Deutsches Frauenwerk, played a central role in shaping women's political consciousness. Through lectures, publications, and training programs, these organizations indoctrinated women with the belief that their work, whether in an office, hospital, or home, was a form of service to the Führer and the nation. For younger women, the Bund Deutscher Mädel, or BDM, League of German Girls, provided early exposure to the ideals of self-sacrifice, obedience, and racial pride. By the time they entered professional life, many had already internalized a sense of moral purpose aligned with state ideology. This fusion of professional identity and political conviction made female workers both efficient and compliant instruments of Nazi governance. With the onset of war in 1939, the regime's dependence on female labor deepened dramatically. As millions of men were conscripted, women took on an ever wider range of duties within the civil service, the military bureaucracy, and the healthcare system. The contradiction between ideology and necessity was resolved by recasting women's public labor as an extension of their maternal duty to the nation. Female clerks and secretaries became helpers to the soldiers and statesmen defending Germany. Nurses on the front lines were celebrated as angels of the battlefield. Propaganda glorified their devotion and endurance while concealing the extent to which their labor sustained the machinery of war and repression. In occupied territories, German women staffed administrative offices that managed deportations, population transfers, and forced labor programs. Their presence lent an air of order and normality to the functioning of an occupation apparatus rooted in violence. The experiences of these women during the war varied widely. Some worked in relative comfort in Berlin ministries or welfare offices. Others endured the dangers and hardships of field hospitals near the front. Many were driven by patriotism or professional ambition rather than ideological zeal. Yet their actions were inseparable from the system they served. The nature of bureaucratic and medical work under totalitarianism blurred traditional moral boundaries. Typing a report, filing a name, or following medical instructions could contribute, often invisibly, to the implementation of mass murder. In this sense, the participation of women in Nazi administration and healthcare exemplifies the banality of evil, later described by Hannah Arendt, the transformation of ordinary, conscientious labor into a mechanism of extraordinary cruelty. The collapse of the Third Reich in 1945 forced these women, along with the rest of German society, to confront the consequences of their participation. In the aftermath of defeat, Allied occupation authorities initiated denazification programs to purge the civil service and medical institutions of Nazi influence. However, women's roles were often downplayed or ignored. Many were classified as followers or sympathizers. The rise of Nazi Germany was not only a political revolution, but also a profound social transformation that redefined the position and purpose of women within society. As Adolf Hitler and the National Socialist German Workers' Party, NSDAP, consolidated power between 1933 and 1939, they introduced a sweeping ideological framework that sought to control every aspect of German life. Central to this framework was the vision of a racially pure Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community, in which every citizen had a defined role. For women, this role was heavily centered around the domestic sphere, motherhood, and service to the nation through family, health, and social welfare. Yet, as Germany prepared for and waged total war, the regime's need for skilled labor and administrative efficiency began to challenge and expand the traditional Nazi image of womanhood. In the years preceding the Nazi takeover, women in the Weimar Republic had experienced unprecedented social freedoms. They had gained the right to vote, entered the workforce in increasing numbers, and were active in politics, education, and professional fields. However, this growing visibility of women in public life became a target for conservative and nationalist backlash. To the Nazis, the emancipation of women symbolized moral decay and a weakening of traditional German values. Hitler himself described feminism as a Jewish invention designed to corrupt the Aryan family. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, one of their early priorities was to reverse these perceived excesses of Weimar modernity. Nazi ideology placed women at the spiritual and biological center of the nation, but not as equals to men. Instead, the regime glorified their roles as mothers and homemakers under the slogan Kinder, Küche, Kirche, children, kitchen, church. Through organizations like the National Socialist Women's League, NS Frauenschaft, and the German women's enterprise, Deutsches Frauenwerk, the regime mobilized women to support its racial and political objectives. These organizations emphasized virtues such as obedience, loyalty, modesty, and sacrifice. Propaganda portrayed women as the guardians of racial purity and the bearers of future soldiers for the Reich. Despite these restrictions, Nazi policy toward women was not entirely regressive. The regime understood the value of women's labor, especially in the fields of education, health, and administration. Women were recruited into positions where their perceived natural traits, compassion, patience, organization, and devotion, could be utilized for the benefit of the state. This was especially evident in the growing number of women serving as civil servants, secretaries, nurses, and welfare workers. These professions allowed women to serve the nation without challenging male authority, aligning practical necessity with ideological consistency. The Nazi regime's approach to women was deeply intertwined with its racial policies. The ideal woman was not only loyal to the Führer, but also racially pure, healthy, and fertile. State programs like the Mother's Cross, Ehrenkreuz der Deutschen Mutter, rewarded women for bearing multiple Aryan children, while marriage loans and tax benefits encouraged early and prolific motherhood. Conversely, women deemed racially unfit, including Jews, Roma, and those with disabilities, were excluded from such privileges and often subjected to sterilization under the 1933 Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring. Thus, gender ideology in Nazi Germany cannot be separated from the regime's broader biopolitical agenda. As the 1930s progressed, the contradiction between ideology and reality became increasingly apparent. The rapid expansion of the Nazi bureaucracy and the militarization of society created a growing demand for clerical and health personnel. Male workers were drafted into the army, leaving vacancies in offices, hospitals, and welfare institutions that women were called upon to fill. This marked the beginning of a gradual redefinition of female labor. While Nazi propaganda continued to extol the virtues of the home and motherhood, the state increasingly depended on women's participation in public service to sustain its operations. Education and vocational training for women also underwent significant transformation under the Nazi regime. Schools and youth organizations, such as the League of German Girls, Bund Deutscher Mädel, indoctrinated girls with notions of duty, racial consciousness, and self-sacrifice. They were trained in domestic skills, first aid, childcare, and physical fitness, preparing them to become healthy mothers or efficient caregivers for the German nation. Higher education for women was discouraged, and by 1939 their university enrollment had been deliberately reduced. However, those who pursued specialized training in nursing, welfare, or clerical work were encouraged because their skills were seen as extensions of their maternal duties to the Volksgemeinschaft. Propaganda played a powerful role in shaping perceptions of women's contributions to the Nazi state. Films, posters, and radio broadcasts idealized female service as both patriotic and feminine. Images of smiling nurses tending to wounded soldiers or secretaries efficiently typing under portraits of Hitler reinforced the notion that women's professional lives were an extension of their devotion to the Führer. The female civil servant was portrayed as disciplined, loyal, and morally pure, a soldier behind the desk. Similarly, the nurse was cast as a nurturing figure whose compassion strengthened the biological and moral health of the Aryan race. By 1939, on the eve of the Second World War, women's roles in Nazi Germany had been fully integrated into the machinery of the state. The early years of the regime had established a strict ideological framework that emphasized domesticity and motherhood, but the practical demands of governance and preparation for war had quietly expanded the boundaries of acceptable female work. Women had become indispensable to the functioning of the Nazi administration and the health sector, even as they remained ideologically subordinate to men. This paradox between the glorification of the housewife and the dependence on the working woman would define the experience of female civil servants and nurses throughout the war years. The transformation of women's roles under the Nazis was thus a story of manipulation and control, but also of adaptation and necessity. Many women entered public service not out of ideological conviction, but because it offered stability, respectability, and a sense of purpose in a rapidly changing world. Others genuinely embraced the Nazi worldview and saw their work as a contribution to the national cause. Regardless of motivation, their participation helped sustain one of the most repressive regimes in modern history, a regime that relied on the devotion and discipline of ordinary people to carry out its extraordinary ambitions. In summary, the rise of Nazi Germany redefined women's lives through a mix of ideological coercion and practical adaptation. The regime exalted the mother, mobilized the worker, and disciplined the servant, turning traditional gender roles into tools of state power. The story of female civil servants and nurses begins here, in this complex intersection of propaganda, policy, and personal agency, where private duty merged with public service in the name of the Führer and the fatherland. The systematic recruitment, training, and indoctrination of women under the Nazi regime were essential components of building the totalitarian state envisioned by Adolf Hitler. After coming to power in 1933, the regime recognized that shaping the minds and skills of women was just as important as controlling their roles. The Nazi leadership aimed not only to dictate where women could work, but also to control what they thought, believed, and valued, through a combination of ideological education and propaganda. Recruitment of women into the Nazi state apparatus and affiliated organizations was highly organized and deliberate. The process began early, often during adolescence, through youth movements such as the Bund Deutscher Mädel, or League of German Girls. Membership in the BDM was presented as an honor, a way for young women to serve the nation and embody Aryan ideals. Girls were trained in obedience, loyalty, and racial consciousness. They learned to prioritize community over individuality, to respect. As young women matured, the Nazi regime steered them toward roles that aligned with its ideological and practical needs. The state needed efficient typists, office clerks, nurses, and welfare workers to maintain its vast bureaucracy and social programs. Recruitment drives often highlighted these jobs as noble forms of service to the Führer and the fatherland. Posters, radio broadcasts, and women's magazines portrayed civil service and nursing as feminine yet heroic careers. This appealed to patriotism, masked the compromises likely to accompany those professions. The training of female civil servants and nurses was a blend of professional instruction and ideological indoctrination. Women entering administrative work were trained in secretarial skills, bookkeeping, correspondence, and bureaucratic procedures. But alongside these practical lessons, they were required to attend lectures on racial theory, Nazi ethics, and the importance of loyalty to Hitler. In these settings, work was portrayed as a sacred duty, and obedience to authority was emphasized as a moral virtue. The Nazi regime established several educational and training institutions to further its ideological objectives. The National Socialist Women's League, NS Frauenschaft, and the German Women's Enterprise, Deutsches Frauenwerk, were at the forefront of organizing courses and seminars for women across Germany. These programs included everything from child-rearing and home economics to first aid and welfare work. Women who displayed leadership potential were often sent to elite training centers. For nurses, the training process was even more deeply infused with ideology. Nursing schools under Nazi supervision were not only medical institutions, but also ideological breeding grounds. Trainees were taught that their duties extended beyond healing the sick. They were also serving the racial and political health of the nation. Eugenics and racial hygiene were key subjects, as nurses were expected to understand who was worthy of care and who was not. Courses taught by Nazi physicians emphasized the importance of maintaining the purity of the Aryan race, even at the expense of certain individuals. Indoctrination also extended to daily life within training institutions. Uniforms, rituals, and ceremonies reinforced the collective identity of female recruits as servants of the nation. Morning assemblies often began with the Nazi salute and the singing of patriotic songs. Classrooms displayed portraits of Hitler and slogans glorifying sacrifice and discipline. Through constant repetition and visual symbolism, women were conditioned to see their personal ambitions as subordinate to the state's needs. Propaganda materials, particularly those targeting women, reinforced the image of the ideal Nazi woman: disciplined, selfless, and racially pure. Magazines such as Frauenwarte, the official women's magazine of the Nazi Party, played a central role in this effort. The publication combined practical advice on cooking, childcare, and home management with political messaging about loyalty, motherhood, and racial duty. It often featured stories of female civil servants and nurses who had dedicated their lives to serving the Führer. The Nazis were acutely aware that ideological training could not rely solely on coercion. Instead, they created a culture of belonging and prestige around participation. Women who joined Nazi-affiliated organizations or state service enjoyed social recognition, economic stability, and in some cases, opportunities for advancement. Those who refused participation or held opposing political beliefs, however, were marginalized and often branded as enemies of the state. This dual strategy of reward and punishment helped ensure high levels of participation and broad compliance with Nazi ideals. As war approached, training became increasingly militarized. Women in civil service were trained to handle wartime administration, logistics, and communications, while nurses received instruction in battlefield medicine and emergency response. The distinction between civilian and military service blurred as women were integrated into the broader apparatus of total war. Indoctrination intensified, emphasizing resilience, duty, and readiness to sacrifice for the survival of the Reich. By 1939, the Nazi regime had successfully created an efficient system of recruitment and ideological conditioning that shaped an entire generation of women. Whether as civil servants or nurses, women entered their professions with a sense of national mission that often masked the moral compromises required by their roles. Many saw themselves as serving humanity or their people, not realizing that their labor and loyalty were also being used to sustain a brutal regime of oppression and genocide. In retrospect, the recruitment and indoctrination of women under the Nazis reveal how propaganda, education, and institutional power can merge to transform ordinary citizens into instruments of state ideology. The female civil servant and nurse of Nazi Germany were products of this calculated system, disciplined, efficient, and convinced of their duty. Their stories illuminate the power of social engineering in shaping both belief and behavior within a totalitarian state. During the Nazi regime, the transformation of women's work within the civil service represented both continuity and rupture from the Weimar period. Women had entered the German bureaucracy in increasing numbers during the 1920s, serving as clerks, typists, and secretaries in municipal and state offices. However, when the National Socialists came to power in 1933, they restructured the civil service not merely as a professional institution, but as an ideological instrument. The regime viewed administrative labor as an extension of the Volksgemeinschaft, the people's community, and therefore demanded political loyalty and conformity. Female civil servants became the quiet machinery that supported the ideological and bureaucratic engine of the Third Reich. Initially, Nazi ideology was ambivalent about women's employment. The regime's public rhetoric glorified the woman as mother and homemaker, promoting the slogan Kinder, Küche, Kirche, or children, kitchen, church. Yet practical needs of governance and an expanding bureaucracy soon overrode this ideological constraint. As men were increasingly drawn into political, military, or industrial roles, the demand for trained clerical workers rose sharply. By the late 1930s, tens of thousands of women were employed in ministries, local government offices, and the Nazi Party's administrative apparatus. They filled the ranks of secretarial pools, stenography divisions, and personnel file departments, ensuring the smooth functioning of every branch of the state. The Reich's bureaucratic system depended on efficiency, accuracy, and discretion, qualities often attributed to female employees by their superiors. Women were trained in stenography, typing, and correspondence at vocational schools and the National Socialist Women's League institutions. Many were members of the Bund Deutscher Mädel, BDM, before entering service, where they absorbed the values of obedience, order, and racial consciousness. Their work was often mundane, drafting letters, maintaining personnel records, registering citizens, but it was also deeply implicated in the machinery of oppression. Through their administrative labor, they sustained systems of surveillance, population control, and racial classification that underpinned the Nazi state. Women in the civil service were bound by a complex code of loyalty. They were required to demonstrate political reliability, and many joined the Nazi Party or affiliated organizations such as the Deutsches Frauenschaft, German Women's Enterprise. In offices such as the Reich Ministry of the Interior, female clerks helped manage vital records that tracked ancestry, health, and racial purity. Some were involved in preparing documents for sterilization programs under the Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring, 1933, while others managed deportation and resettlement lists in occupied territories during the war years. Though most women saw themselves as performing routine clerical duties, their tasks facilitated the systematic persecution of minorities and political opponents. Working conditions for female civil servants were shaped by both gender hierarchy and wartime necessity. Women earned less than men, rarely advanced to supervisory positions, and were often expected to resign upon marriage, at least until the late 1930s when labor shortages forced a partial reversal of this policy. The Nazi state cultivated an image of the loyal, modest, and efficient female worker, who served the Führer's goals without ambition for personal advancement. Uniforms and codes of conduct reinforced discipline and ideological unity. Despite limited power, these women wielded influence through their control of information, records, and bureaucratic communication. As the war expanded, so too did women's roles within the administrative apparatus. By 1942, female clerks were indispensable to both civil and military offices. In occupied territories, German women staffed district administrations, worked as interpreters, and assisted in compiling data for deportation orders and forced labor allocations. Their presence behind typewriters and filing cabinets made them witnesses and sometimes participants in the regime's genocidal policies. After 1945, many of these women denied complicity, describing themselves as mere typists or little cogs in the machine. Yet historians have since shown that even clerical work carried moral and political weight within a totalitarian system. The legacy of female civil servants in Nazi Germany remains complex. On one hand, they embodied the contradictions of a regime that both restricted and relied upon women's labor. On the other, they reveal the extent to which ordinary administrative work could sustain an extraordinary regime of terror. Their efficiency and conformity were celebrated by their superiors, but in retrospect, they serve as reminders of how bureaucracy can become an instrument of oppression when divorced from ethical responsibility. In countless offices across the Reich, women's steady hands and meticulous records quietly enforced the racial and ideological order of National Socialism. The role of nurses and care workers in Nazi Germany was deeply intertwined with the regime's racial and ideological ambitions. Long before Hitler's rise to power, Germany had a proud tradition of professional nursing that dated back to the 19th century. However, under National Socialism, the practice of nursing was redefined as an instrument of racial hygiene and national rejuvenation. Nurses were expected not only to heal and comfort, but also to serve as guardians of the Volk. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, they quickly sought to coordinate all aspects of the healthcare system under party control. The National Socialist People's Welfare, NSV, became one of the largest social organizations in the Reich, overseeing hospitals, maternity homes, and youth health services. Within this network, female nurses, midwives, and social workers became indispensable. Their duties extended far beyond patient care. They were expected to embody Nazi values of discipline, obedience, and racial purity. The role of women in Nazi Germany's ideological and racial policies presents a troubling intersection of belief, obedience, and participation. While Nazi propaganda idealized women as nurturers and mothers of the Aryan nation, it also enlisted them as active agents in enforcing racial hierarchy and social conformity. Female civil servants, nurses, teachers, and welfare workers were integral to the machinery of the Nazi state, not only by performing administrative tasks, but by shaping the ideological foundation of women's work in the Third Reich rested on the principle of racial purity. National Socialist racial theory, influenced by eugenics and social Darwinism, sought to engineer a biologically healthy national community, or Volksgemeinschaft. Women were assigned a critical role in this vision. They were to safeguard the racial future by giving birth to Aryan children and preventing the reproduction of those deemed unfit. The law for the prevention of hereditarily disease. In practice, women became instruments of surveillance and control within their communities. Midwives, nurses, and welfare officials were required to report cases of hereditary disease, mental illness, or asocial behavior. Their reports often triggered investigations, sterilizations, or institutionalization. Bureaucratic paperwork, compiled largely by female clerks and administrators, became the foundation for racial policy implementation. Seemingly routine tasks like filling forms or verifying ancestry, the Nazi Party also mobilized women through its mass organizations to spread racial ideology. The National Socialist Women's League, NS Frauenschaft, and the German women's enterprise, Deutsches Frauenwerk, trained women to teach racial hygiene, domestic discipline, and political loyalty. They organized lectures, exhibitions, and family counseling sessions, where the principles of eugenics were presented as moral obligations. Through such means, female teachers played a crucial role in shaping the next generation. They taught children to value Aryan traits, avoid racial defilement, and respect the Führer's will as a natural order. Textbooks in biology and home economics incorporated lessons about heredity and racial difference. Young girls in the League of German Girls, Bund Deutscher Mädel, learned that their highest duty was to bear strong and healthy children for the Reich. This indoctrination, reinforced through rituals, uniforms, and songs, nurses and doctors' assistants in hospitals and psychiatric institutions were among the first women to witness the deadly application of racial policy. In the sterilization courts, women provided medical data that justified operations. In the euthanasia centers, they were present as caregivers to those marked for death. Although not all understood the full scope of the killings, many complied willingly, believing their actions served the higher goal of racial hygiene. This moral confusion. In the occupied territories, women's involvement in racial policy extended beyond Germany's borders. Female administrators, translators, and secretaries worked in offices responsible for the deportation of Jews, Poles, and other targeted populations. German nurses in Eastern Europe staffed hospitals for ethnic Germans, while ignoring or excluding local civilians. Some participated in the selection of forced laborers, applying racial criteria to determine who would be sent to Germany. The work of female welfare officials in the Nazi racial state was especially influential in determining social worth. Their visits to homes, assessment of family life, and evaluations of mothers were guided by Nazi standards of racial and moral health. A woman could be denied welfare assistance or have her children taken away if she was deemed racially inferior or asocial. These actions, carried out in the name of public welfare, female participation in Nazi racial policy was sustained by a mixture of conviction, conformity, and coercion. Many women genuinely believed in the ideals of racial renewal and national unity. Others adapted to the system for personal security or social mobility. Few had direct power, yet their daily labor sustained the bureaucratic and social foundations of genocide. By embedding racial ideology in the routines of welfare, healthcare, and education, women made Nazism appear normal and even benevolent. After the war, the complicity of women in ideological and racial crimes was often minimized or overlooked. Post-war narratives portrayed them as victims or bystanders rather than participants. Only later historical research exposed the depth of their involvement, challenging traditional assumptions about gender and guilt. The image of the innocent woman of the Third Reich gave way to a more complex understanding that women, too, were capable of ideological commitment and moral blindness. The study of women's involvement in Nazi racial policies forces historians to confront uncomfortable truths about the relationship between care, duty, and cruelty. The very qualities that were celebrated in women, nurturing, efficiency, loyalty, were redirected toward the goals of exclusion and extermination. By examining their roles in the enforcement of racial policy, one sees not only how ideology shaped their actions, but also how everyday life in the Third Reich became complicit in its crimes. The outbreak of war in 1939 marked a decisive turning point for women in Nazi Germany. As the nation mobilized for total war, the state's previous restrictions on female employment were gradually abandoned in favor of necessity. The demands of the conflict drew hundreds of thousands of women into roles that had once been considered inappropriate or unnecessary for their gender. From clerical work in the military bureaucracy to nursing on the front lines. Initially, the Nazi regime had been reluctant to mobilize women. Hitler and other party leaders feared that large-scale female employment would undermine the ideal of the home-centered Aryan woman. However, by 1940, labor shortages made ideological rigidity unsustainable. As men were drafted into the Wehrmacht, women filled their vacated positions in civil service, industry, agriculture, and communications. The Reich Neighbor Service for Women, Reichsarbeitsdienst für die weibliche Jugend. Within the German armed forces, women served in auxiliary roles that expanded rapidly after the invasion of Poland and the subsequent escalation of the war. The Luftwaffe employed female communications personnel, clerks, and meteorological assistants. The Wehrmacht created auxiliary corps for women known as Helferinnen, female helpers, who managed logistics, correspondence, and code operations. Although they were officially non-combatants, female nurses represented another crucial component of wartime service. With the intensification of combat on multiple fronts, field hospitals and convalescent centers required enormous numbers of trained personnel. Nurses from the German Red Cross, the National Socialist People's Welfare, and the Order of the Sisters of the German Red Cross were deployed across Europe. They tended to wounded soldiers, organized medical evacuations, and worked under harrowing conditions. In occupied territories, the role of women extended far beyond medical or administrative support. Female clerks and secretaries staffed the offices of occupation authorities, Gestapo branches, and SS administrative units. They typed orders, managed transport schedules, and compiled reports related to deportations, forced labor, and executions. Some women served as interpreters and liaisons in regions like Poland and Ukraine, where their duties often intersected with the implementation of genocidal policies. Women also played a key role in propaganda and morale maintenance during the war. Members of the National Socialist Women's League organized relief drives, distributed food and clothing to soldiers' families, and supervised childcare in communities affected by conscription. Through these efforts, women sustained the home front and reinforced the image of unwavering unity under the Führer. Propaganda posters depicted them as stoic, efficient, and loyal. Despite the expansion of their responsibilities, female workers continued to face discrimination and limited recognition. They were often paid less than their male counterparts and denied formal military status or pensions. Many women viewed their wartime service as patriotic duty rather than personal advancement. However, the war forced a re-evaluation of gender norms, as women demonstrated competence in technical, administrative, and logistical fields previously dominated by men. As the war turned against Germany after 1942, the demands on women intensified further. Allied bombings devastated cities, and women were mobilized for emergency response, civil defense, and reconstruction efforts. Air raid wardens, ambulance drivers, and communication operators, many of them young women, worked tirelessly amid chaos and destruction. In rural areas, women managed farms and food production, often combining physical labor with administrative oversight in the absence of men. The home front, by 1944, with the Eastern Front collapsing, female auxiliaries were stationed closer to combat zones. Some served as radio operators or intelligence clerks under the direct command of the SS. Others were captured by the Allies during retreats or Soviet advances. Their experiences varied dramatically. Some endured severe hardship, while others remained ideologically committed to the end. For many, the end of the war in 1945 brought chaos, displacement, and reckoning. Thousands of female auxiliaries and nurses found themselves prisoners of war or subjects of interrogation. In post-war trials, most were classified as followers rather than perpetrators, reflecting both gender bias and the difficulty of proving individual responsibility within vast bureaucratic systems. Nonetheless, their involvement in wartime administration and logistics was critical to the functioning of the Nazi war machine. The wartime experience of women in Nazi Germany reveals a profound transformation in gender roles under the pressures of total war. While the regime had promised them domestic honor, the necessities of conflict drew them into public, professional, and even militarized spaces. Their contributions sustained the war effort, but also implicated them in its crimes. The expansion of their duties after 1939 thus embodies the paradox of the Third Reich's gender ideology. In retrospect, the story of women on the wartime front challenges simplistic portrayals of passivity or victimhood. It demonstrates the capacity of ordinary individuals to adapt, endure, and participate in the functioning of an authoritarian state. Whether through conviction, conformity, or survival, these women helped maintain the illusion of stability amid catastrophe. Their lives illuminate both the resilience and the moral compromises of a society consumed by war. In examining their experiences,